Our next presenter is Leslie Sturges. She is the president of Bat Conservation and Rescue of Virginia. Today's topic is welfare during bat rehabilitation. Leslie?
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here, and I really am excited to follow Dr. Bowen's excellent talk about bats and bat diversity because it feeds right into what I'm going to talk about today. We are a rehabilitation, conservation, and education organization. We've been around in various guises since 2001 when I took Bat World Boot Camp from Bat World Sanctuary, and I've been rehabilitating native insectivorous bats in the Mid-Atlantic since then. So I've seen a lot of big brown bats. This talk today is not going to be very much how to rehabilitate. We're going to talk about welfare considerations in bat rehabilitation with very much an emphasis on why we do things the way we do. So here we go. And the slide should advance. It is not. I'm really sorry about this. I'm gonna actually, I don't know why we're having this problem. Sorry. I apologize. Windows updated this morning and it has not been going well. So my apologies for not having this working a little better. All right, let's try that. All righty. So again, I had to start everything. I apologize. So I would like to start with defining what is wildlife rehabilitation. And there's a standard definition used by the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association that wildlife rehabilitation is the treatment and temporary care of injured, diseased, displaced indigenous animals and the subsequent release of healthy animals to appropriate habitats in the wild. And the question that always comes out to me when I look at this definition is, what do we mean by healthy? It's obvious that, of course, a rehabilitated animal has to be healthy. It has to be able to function on the landscape from when it came. It needs to be able to locomote appropriately. It needs to be able to forage, all those things that we think of while doing out on the landscape. But I think one thing that gets skipped often in rehabilitation is that rehabilitated animals need to be behaviorally healthy. They must be able to function as part of their populations through behaviors such as communication, establishing a home range, competing for territory, finding the resources they need, interacting with their own population in normal ways so that they can select an appropriate mate and successfully reproduce. I don't think rehabilitation should result in animals going out on the landscape that don't know how to be. They absolutely need to be what they were meant to be and function as such. We are having trouble advancing again. I'm sorry. I really don't know what's going on here.
Leslie, I think we have your presentation.
I got
Would
it.
you like us to put it up?
Nope, I got it. I think I figured out where the issue is.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your help, though. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, everybody. I've done Zoom and Hoova about 1 million times before, but I feel like every time there's something new. So I appreciate your patience. So anyway, we've defined what rehabilitation is. Let's talk about what it is not. Rehabilitation is not captive breeding. It's not assurance colonies. It's not maintenance of ambassador animals. It's not long-term captive management that spans years. And it is, despite what the public thinks we are capable of doing, it is not taking in animals that need amputations or need prosthetics in order to function. Those things rightfully belong under captive management. However, it does get a little squishy because some rehabilitators do maintain ambassador animals, and we also, some of the facilities maintain captive colonies of non-native species, even of non-native species. So we can, as rehabilitators, be moving in and out of strict rehabilitation and captive management. And then we also have some of these animals that are coming in, bats in particular, are going to spend a great deal of time in care because we have winters to deal with here in the temperate area. So we may be getting in an animal in early winter that is not going to be releasable until the weather finally breaks in spring. So there seems to be a lot of migration in and out of captive care and rehabilitation, but I think it's important to bear in mind that rehabilitation and captive management are not the same thing because the goals differ. With rehabilitation, we want to get functional, healthy animals back in the landscape so that they can become part of their normal population. Somehow we got an extra slide in there. All righty. But bat rehabilitation is important. And I heard a question yesterday, which I thought sort of encapsulated it. It's like, well, why should we rehabilitate animals that maybe might have a disease or be part of a disease control population? Well, I'm sitting in very close to ground zero of white nose syndrome. We have functionally lost most of our myotis, our little brown bats, and a great deal of our tricolors and northern long ears. So we're at a point now where the population is so very small that yes, every bat is precious. And we've also learned because of white nose syndrome that it really only takes one thing to take a very abundant population of a species and practically wipe it out. So rehabilitation does play a role, and I'm quoting here a study that was done that is a modeling study, but it looked at what animals might benefit from rehabilitation, and it turns out that under modeling, the animals that have low fecundity, long lives, and a lot of parental investment, returning healthy individuals to those populations did seem that it would have a positive impact. So I think that's important to keep in mind that yes, we can be contributing to these rapidly declining or practically gone populations. But if we're going to look at it that way, we must make sure that the rehabilitation we are doing is good, is appropriate. Because if we're putting animals out there that don't know how to be what they're supposed to be, that's a reduced likelihood of survival. If they're not physically able to do what they need to do, that's a reduced possibility of survival. And this presents a potentially serious welfare concern if they are unable to adapt or are more susceptible to threats than wild counterparts. That seems like that should be just, you could surmise that with a little bit of thought, but perhaps that isn't the case. And maybe people do need to think a great deal about what we're putting back out onto the landscape and why we're doing it. So I'm going to run through this really quickly because you've seen this already. But bats or mammals are the only mammal capable of self-powered flight. And we need to know what they are and what they're doing in order to rehabilitate them appropriately. We have to remember there's great diversity. Even in the mid-Atlantic here in Virginia, we have 16 different species of bats, and we need to know their natural history and what they're supposed to be doing out there. All of our guys are insectivorous here, but they still have a wide variety of roosting habitats. Their body temperature fluctuates depending on their environmental needs, and all of our guys break these small mammal rules. Relative to size, they're the most long-lived animal we know of. Someone's already mentioned the Brandt's bat, 41 years. And in here in the United States, we've got a couple records of little browns into the 30s. So these animals need to know stuff in order to survive out there on the landscape because they are by and large, they have high social intelligence. They need to know how to get along, low reproductive rate. You've heard all this other stuff before, but one thing I would like to point out is these little tiny animals are taking up a great deal of airspace in order to get along in their lives. So they might be migratory, or they might just be foraging fantastic amounts of space out there in the night sky. So we need to prepare them to be able to do that. And lives, especially in temperate areas, vary by season. We need to know what season it is, or well, obviously we know what season it is, but we need to know what the bats are doing for the season that they're coming in. So I will tell you right now that a big brown bat in early spring, male big brown bat in early spring is an entirely different animal come mating season in fall. So there are behavioral ramifications for their seasonality, as well as what they're doing on the landscape and what one needs to be prepared for and prepare them for. So you just saw this video. I'm going to play it again. I am obviously forgot to share my sound, but you saw this before, and I have this in here because I want you to see the physicality of what this animal is doing as it's foraging in Corcoran Lab. You can get these videos on YouTube. I highly recommend sharing them with people because our eyes don't see what these bats have to be able to do in order to apprehend prey. And of course, they're doing it with echolocation. So this is a very expensive thing. They're high energy output here. They have to be very physically adept. They also miss a lot because they're predators. But if you just look at how much twisting and turning, the flexibility this animal is putting into apprehending prey and now flying on its back for a little bit, and it's going to rotate itself around and move off. So this is what they need to be prepared to do out there on the landscape. And they need to be able to echolocate while they're doing it, which has been discussed a lot in Dr. Bones' talk. So they are born echolocating, but it is in part a learned skill. They need to practice how to match the speed of their flight to their own pulses. They need to learn how to interpret echoes. They need to learn how to navigate using this skill. So they need to practice, and young bats do practice. One thing as far as welfare and rehabilitation is concerned is echolocation is loud. And yes, when they emit their pulse, they are temporarily deafening themselves, but they are listening for their own echoes coming back. So an echolocating bat can be operating up at around 140 dB. So that is just insanely loud. And so you do need to think about their soundscape. What is surrounding them? What are those echoes bouncing off of? And a few recent papers have come out showing that vertical glass distorts echolocation and can become invisible to them. And horizontal glass looks like water. So I think when we're housing bats or when we're putting bats into flight enclosures, we do need to think about the surfaces that they're encountering and how that might be impacting what they're doing with echolocation. And please remember that echolocation itself is for gathering information. Vocalizations are for giving information, I think is the best explanation I've heard of it. So they need to learn how to do both of those things. They need to learn how to echolocate for prey apprehension, for navigation, and then they also need to learn appropriate vocalizations for communication and whatever other behaviors they need to do out there on the landscape. So how do young bats normally learn these things? And I'm going to spend a little more time on the young because I think for bat rehabilitation, many of us, at least 50% of our intakes are going to be orphans, or if not orphans, at least separated from parents. So if you're a young mammal, you use physical behaviors such as practice and play to practice what you need to do as an adult. But they're also in contact with adult conspecifics. So they're learning appropriate behaviors, vocalizations, they're mimicking all kinds of stuff. And they're often in physical contact. And there's a lot to be said for how much mental health is given to growing young mammals through the comfort of physical contact. If you just look, particularly bats, or even, look at a pile of gray squirrels growing up, they're in a puppy heap. That's just how they do it. And so these guys really spend a lot of time in physical contact with each other. And then when you're looking at bats and a colonial bat species, they are always in contact with each other unless they're out foraging. So I think they must have a lot of information transfer that's going on, not just through hearing each other, but also through physical contact. And then, of course, they learn from experience. That's sort of a vertebrate thing, we think, and particularly mammals. Mammal brains are mammal brains. And we learn from experiences. So, pups in rehabilitation. But pups are actually pretty bouncy is the best way I can describe it. They are sort of built to take a fall, and they need to be able to climb. This was mentioned earlier. If they fall out of the colony or fall from a roost, they need to be able to get to safety. And so they're pretty good at skittering and getting up to a surface and going up it. They grow really quickly for our temperate insectivores. These guys have a growth rate that's similar to songbirds. So they have a very short window in which to grow and learn and become the bats they need to be. And they start practice flying at around 4 weeks for our species, but they may nurse, and Amanda mentioned this earlier, they were nursing often until they can forage for themselves because otherwise they wouldn't survive. So 6 to 8 weeks seems to be about right for wild bats, but we know that some of them may, if they can, go ahead and, be reliant on the mothers until they're really good at taking care of themselves. There is high parental investment. Pups nurse all day. As long as they're in contact with the mother when they're small, they're nursing, and it's very nutritionally dense milk. Mothers have been recorded returning to the roost about every 15 minutes when pups are first born, and they're out foraging and they're coming back to nurse that frequently. So they're feeding these pups a lot so that the pups can grow as quickly as they need to. So one of the best ways to avoid welfare issues in rehabilitation is not to bring healthy animals into rehabilitation. We do get plump pups that have no ectoparasites, that have a milk patch visible in the stomach, and those are pups that could very well be reunited, particularly with colonial bats, because if you can get them back into the roost, get them back into the colony, then the mother is going to retrieve them and take care of them. We don't have to. She's going to do a better job. So we really want to avoid bringing anything into rehab that doesn't need it. However, we do find pups wandering away from any known colony, and if they're thin and if they have a ectoparasite load, then those are probably, they either got hopelessly lost or the mother is no longer around. So if you're trying to find a colony, look up and look for the guano. These guys produce an insane amount of guano, so it's not that hard to find an extant colony if there is one available and you do want to return them. I could do a whole talk on reunion and methods of reunion, so I'm going to skip over that for now. If you have questions, please reach out to someone. So once they come in because you couldn't find the colony, or a lot of times we find that landowners, property owners don't want the pups put back. They just don't want the bats at all. So of course, we're going to work hard with them to try and get them to keep the pups on site, but sometimes it doesn't happen. And sometimes you do there are pups that clearly are not being fed and need to come in. So we know that they need to learn how to do what they need to do with us, a woefully inadequate parent. So we need to give them the opportunity to develop the skills they need to develop. And we can do that by giving them safety and appropriate ways to practice and helping them teach themselves what they need to do. But if you've got adult conspecifics in your facility, use them. They may not be safe to be in physical contact, but they can certainly be within auditory proximity. They could maybe be close enough to observe. And if it's safe and if you can, I put my juveniles with adult males because I don't know why, but they seem to put up with them more than even the females will. But we make sure that our juveniles have access to adults so that they can learn appropriate behaviors. And they need to obviously have experiences while they're in rehabilitation that challenge them both physically and mentally. I don't think keeping animals that need to go out onto a wild landscape and make and meet the challenges of being a wild animal, I don't think they're well served by overprotecting them. And of course, we want them to be safe and unharmed, but I mean, we also need to give them the kind of challenges, mental challenges, learn how to rise to those needs. So they need welfare for bat pups requires social contact. These guys need to touch each other. There are a couple times where I've heard of agencies saying that bats had to be reared in isolation to prevent disease transmission. And I just feel like that is so unspeakable, and that we might as well just euthanize those pups because they can't possibly grow up to be bats if they can't touch each other. And I'm talking conspecifics here. I don't necessarily think we should be mixing up a bunch of different species, but there's a study I found where it showed that these bats actually form durable social bonds from their proximity to one another as they grow. And so I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. They need to learn how to be with each other. And of course, they do need to learn how to communicate with each other. We haven't shown in big browns that they're learning vocally, and Dr. Bone mentioned this, but they do have to learn communication skills. So they need to learn submissive postures. They need to learn, what get off my foot means. They need to learn these things. So they need each other. And even if you don't have adults that they can safely live with, they're learning a lot from their interactions with each other. So it's very important that they have that opportunity. So what do they need? They need an appropriate environment for their age. They need each other. I cannot emphasize that enough. They need each other. They need good nutrition. They actually need a little bit of sunshine. They need exercises. They need exercise. They need experience. They need practice. And then they need to be released. So in order to figure out what you're doing with them, you need to be able to recognize developmental stages. And so you've got your neonates, your pups, juveniles. So, you have naked, hairless, then they start to sprout hair, and then they get a lot more hair, and then they start to look like adults, but they're not really adults yet. And you need to be able to recognize when you've got a juvenile that may or may not be flighted, or it may be slightly flighted. And the guy on the green fuzzy stuff over there at the very far right, that one I actually found on my door stoop. He clearly took off for trying to fly and probably didn't have his steering under control yet. So I just brought him in for the day and then put him back outside, and I saw his mom flying around, and so he was reunited in the colony. But I've had a lot of people bring me bats like that on the assumption that those are adults and they can't figure out why they're not flying. Well, not really an adult yet. So they do, again, they're taking support from their mothers at a very large size. So you can see the big brown on the bottom right is nursing from its mother, and he's just as big as she is. I don't know how she puts up with him. And one thing that people should get familiar with is being able to differentiate a juvenile from an adult by looking at joints. The photo here, this is a deceased bat, which is why there's a bare hand in there. But you can look at the elongated joints where the metacarpals meet the phalanges, and you can see the translucent window painting there. That means that the epiphyses are not calcified yet, and that this is still a juvenile bat. So here's some red bat development for you. And you can see they grow quickly, and they are, however, very dependent on that physical contact with their mothers. At about day 6, we start to see that she leaves them in their little pup clump and goes off and does other things. But they are very quick, very fast growth rate there. So they need an appropriate environment for their developmental stage. So for hairless neonates, or just furred neonates, or pups that aren't quite ready to thermoregulate for themselves, incubators, they work. We've actually upgraded our incubators to use variable fan speed incubators because a fan blowing in an incubator is about 60 dB, which is the level of normal human conversation. And those things are usually running 24/7. And I don't know that that is healthy for an animal. that is highly auditory and has very sensitive hearing. So we've actually upgraded so that our incubators can be, the speed fan can be turned down, and we've got it down to about 20 dB. I think that's important. You need really good humidity control for your incubators. That gets tough when they're fighting a forced air system. So if you can upgrade incubators, look at more modern styles to do it. And then as soon as they have fur, we get them into large spaces where they can climb. That's a large zippered dog crate on the right. And so they can climb and experience things and practice and exercise and do all the things they need to do because they've got the space to do it. So why? Why are we doing this with them? Why are we housing them this way? It's because of the way they grow up in the wild. So on the left, you have a big brown bat who has 2 neonates under her wings, and that's where they live. They live in an incredibly humid, warm environment. And so until they start sprouting fur, that's where she keeps them. And we've actually had big browns give birth in captivity where you wouldn't even know because they're so tucked under there. And just as an aside, I would like to point out that when you hear from pest control people who say, I didn't see any juveniles, that's why. They don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what to look for. But that is how a neonate big brown bat pup spends its time with its mother in that lovely warm environment. And then just a week or two, a couple weeks later, here you have this bat box colony, juveniles hanging out in the light zone, I would like to point out. They may be hot, or they may just be getting a little bit of sunshine there. I'd like to see some more research done on this aspect of big brown bat behavior. But you can see they're separate from their mothers at this point. They've got fur, they can thermoregulate, they can move around on their own. So that's what we're doing in rehabilitation, is giving them those opportunities. And then on the right here, we have the red bats and the teeny tiny naked babies tucked in under the mother's tail membrane and wings. And if you're not sure, there's her face right there. This is her wrist, and this is her tail membrane actually down over, keeping these pups down against her belly, nice and warm and humid. And then here's the same batch just a little bit later with fur, able to actually start hanging by themselves. And she's grooming the wings and encouraging that wing to open up, and that's a form of exercise. So they need each other. They must have each other. Even so-called solitary bats, such as red bats, are social as pups. They're in a sibling group, and you can take any mixed age class of juvenile red bats and they will find each other and they will form a clump. And that's what they do. They are insistent. They must have each other, and they will cling to each other and groom each other and just sort of live as they look like a little fuzzy cluster of grapes. And then we have our unrelated juvenile big brown bats find each other. They form their little cohort and they stay together. And we actually try to release together when we have cohorts formed because they need the support of each other. And then if you look at what happens in the wild, when the colony heads out for the night to forage, they forage together for a little bit, they interact with each other in the sky, and then they disperse for the evening. So why? Again, these are social animals, even so-called solitary animals. And I want to point out, here's our smallest, youngest one. They're already outside because they're fully furred and they can thermoregulate, even this little one. And she just stuck herself in the middle of these other two because solitary is a thing that a label that we gave. And these are clearly not solitary bats when they're juveniles. And again, here's another cohort of juvenile big browns. They need good nutrition, and this is just a really crucial issue. Remember, these are very fast-growing animals. You don't have a lot of time to mess up. So the wing you're looking at here is a bat that was fed on Fox Valley 3240, and if you're not a rehabilitator, that's just denotes how much protein and fat you have in the formula mix you're using. And this didn't actually turn up until the beginnings was when the bat came into my care, but this damage had already been done and just progressed until a point where she was irrecoverable and we had to euthanize her. This is an incredibly painful condition that is brought about by an imbalance of nutrients, Maybe it's calcium, maybe it's phosphorus, maybe it's how they're taking on calcium. We don't really know, but they are so fast growing that they have to be fed appropriately. And the biggest issue is we're not entirely sure what appropriate is, because there's no one perfect formula for bats, because the species are not closely related. So please recall what you learned about bat diversity from previous talks. These guys, like red bat, is not at all closely related to a big brown bat. And there are also regional differences in insect availability to mothers seasonally. So we don't even know if like a big brown in Northern California has the same nutrient makeup to milk that a big brown in, here in Virginia would have. We don't know. We just don't have enough data. If you don't have something approximating appropriate, and talk to people in your region to get that information, please transfer those pups to someone who does. Another thing we're finding, and I apologize, I could not figure out how to get the pointer out of this image, but we have also found that large facilities that are doing multiple species may not prioritize bat feeding, because these guys are hard and they actually need to eat 24 hours on a 24/7 cycle, especially when they're very, very young. So they do deserve the same nutritional support as any other animal in rehabilitation. So it's important that if people are contemplating rehabilitating bats, that they are willing to put the time and the effort in order to avoid not raising actual bats. So milk replacers, which are what most formulas are based on in rehabilitation. First, we need to know, what are we replacing? Do we have any nutrient studies? And I will tell you right now, for a lot of bat species, we don't. There is not a single milk analysis study on red bats or hoary bats or evening bats. So we just don't know. And then when we're looking at the replacers, we want to look at the ingredients. What is in the stuff, and oftentimes you'll see it's vegetable oil is the fat source. What vegetable? Is that vegetable oil appropriate to be feeding to this particular mammal? We don't know half the time. And also, how are these milk replacers being stored prior to a rehabilitator getting them? I mean, we don't know how long something's been sitting on a container ship before it got to the lab or to the manufacturing facility. We don't know from the manufacturing facility, did it sit on a pallet out behind the retail store for a week before it went on the shelves? We don't know. So freshness of ingredients is really important. Preparation is important. Things have to be prepared according to manufacturer directions. You can't just go scoop, 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 shake, shake, feed. That does not work. You don't get an appropriate product to put into the animal. You need to think about storage of the prepared formula. How quickly should it be used? Can you freeze it? Can you not freeze it? And then how do you get it into the pup? And you need to think about the temperature of the formula, the frequency you're feeding, the amount you're feeding, and the equipment. And I will tell you, in this little video here, we've got a little neonate bat who is using what's called a Miracle Nipple Mini. And I use these for everybody because they work for me. There are other people who use what's a sponge tip, and they do better with that because it works for them. So you also need to figure out what are you comfortable using, and what goes in actually is getting into the animal. And we can't expect them to be easy. These are wild animals we know very little about. This is true across the spectrum of wildlife rehabilitation. None of this is easy. So anybody who's going into rehabilitation because they think that, cottontails are cute is in for a very rude awakening when it comes time to actually get food into those animals. So a word about mealworms, because we almost always transition to mealworms. They're the easiest thing to manage. This has already been brought up in the nutrition talk, is that these are not a complete food. Bats don't eat larvae in the wild. Larvae have very high fat to chitin ratio, so they're not great, but they're what we have. So we try to make the best possible mealworm we can. Are there some useful alternatives? Maybe. I get just flat out refusals on palatability on some of these things. But yeah, it's a good idea to mix it up and do as much as you can. We get away with using a lot of mealworms because our guys are going outside and they're eating wild food once they're out in the outdoor enclosure. So they also need exercise. These guys have to be strong, right? And we as humans have a tendency to overfeed things in our care, and we try not to, but it happens. You know, these guys are under less pressure than their wild counterparts are because, you know, we're trying to make sure they grow right. So we have them eating regularly, and probably, you know, maybe our diets are a little too high in carbs or maybe too high in fat or whatever, but we tend to grow some fat bat pups. So we need to make sure they're exercising adequately. So give them enough space. Let them, you know, crawl up and down on things, climb into and out of things, hide. They need to be able to do these things. So they need to be able to skitter into a crevice to save themselves at some point in the wild. So give them some crevices to run in and out of. Use lots of different surfaces, use variation in height, give them each other. They mess around with each other all the time. And then you can do a lot to encourage motion. But they absolutely have to get adequate exercise. So this is sort of how it works with us. And I'm sorry, this little bat is flapping at me. So I encourage them with my voice, and I also just do hand flaps in front of them and they will flap back. So I'm part of the encouraging talk, getting them to, you know, be what they're supposed to be. They're exercising those shoulder girdles while they're running around in there and sticking their faces in water dishes and flapping back at me. And really what that little guy is doing right there is soliciting. And then, but look, it eventually took off flying, found out there wasn't any food down there, and then is going back, and it's going to do it all over again. So this is what we need to do to make sure they're getting adequate exercise. We have to be part of the picture. And then once you've got them all brave, you can let them do it on their own. And this is them in a flight cage at night, and we just run blink cameras so we can see what they're doing. And you can see they're practicing. So once you feel like they're strong enough and they can, we try to get them self-feeding before we put them outside, because getting them self-feeding is giving them a gift of independence. They're not really dependent on us anymore. So we start working on a weaning system pretty early on. When their teeth start coming in, we're starting to introduce whole mealworms so that they, or we put them on slurry sometimes, depending on the number we have and how many we're trying to feed. The last video you watched, those are actually slurry bowls, and they learn to come down and feed themselves. But again, that's giving them the idea that they can be independent and they don't need us anymore. And the next step is you're going to let them be challenged. You're going to get them outside and make sure that they are familiar with the night, with noises, with, you know, the sounds they're going to experience outside. And even when they're inside, you can start that process by opening your windows and letting natural temperature variations happen. Give them space. They need tons of space to explore and to climb and to crash and to do all the things that they would be doing in the wild. And you just have the advantage of you can keep them from becoming separated from their mother, because, well, that's already happened. So again, give them each other and give them the opportunity to have experiences. And I just want to point out this little not brand new, but very young juvenile on the top right. I gave them, that's a dog toy asparagus I picked up at Petco or something, and it opens on the bottom. And that little bat crawled into that crack and then just squeezed her way all the way up to the top because she felt like it was something she wanted to do. So we need to give them those experiences and the opportunity to use their minds as well as their bodies. And you'd be surprised at what they'll explore given the opportunity. Apparently cameras are quite fascinating. And then when they're outside and you've given them all those opportunities and all that ability to exercise and got them strong and taught them how to feed themselves, this is what you should see in your flight enclosures. Just all kinds of action. Our flight enclosure is octagonal. So it's basically round. It has a center structure, so they're not going end to end to end to end. So they're going in circles. I'm going to skip this slide. This is a highlight slide. You can read at your leisure when you review. So that's pups. That's how we make sure that pups know how to be the bats that they're supposed to be. Adults. I cannot tell you how many times I get a bat transferred to me, and one exam I find there's a fracture, there's an abscess, there's a wound that was not noticed, and now we're weeks into this animal's care, and now we're fighting the clock if the animal is even recoverable at that point. So intake exams are crucial. The entire bat has to be looked at. You have to assess nutritional status, dehydration. You have to know, is there a break somewhere in that wing? What caused that bat to be in rehab? And so learning to do thorough intake exams, it just saves so much trouble down the road. And not thoroughly examining an animal coming into rehabilitation is a serious welfare concern, because I don't feel real good when I open up a wing and find that there's been a fracture there for 2 weeks. It's now partially calloused in a bad position, cannot be corrected, and that animal's had been in pain all that time. So these animals deserve a thorough intake exam and from someone knowledgeable. So if people who don't feel comfortable doing this, find someone who is and sit with them and let them help you figure out how to do it. So how do you unpack all those parts? Obviously, you're wearing your gloves and your PPE. I like to use a gloved hand plus a handling cloth. And then we call it the cuddle hold. You're using your fingers and your thumb to control the head, and you can just move fingers away and reach in and pull out the parts you need to look at. You can change their orientation in your non-dominant hand and use your dominant hand to look at all the parts. But this is the way. We don't dangle, we don't scruff, we use this hold, and then this way we can see everything we need to see. I also hear, well, I put the mealworms in there and it won't eat it. Well, of course it's not going to eat a dish out of a dish of mealworms. These are aerial hawking, most of them hawk, some of them do glean, but most of these are aerial hawkers, and they're getting prey flying in the night sky. So what on earth would tell them that stuff wiggling in a dish is food? So this is another welfare concern. They must eat, and don't get, I hear people who rehab terrestrial animals, they kind of get mad because bats just won't figure it out. Well, if you're a bird rehabber, neither will chimney swifts. So they're just some animals, their mental state tells them what is food and what is not food. And so you have to teach you can teach bats that it's food. It doesn't take that much effort, but just plopping a dish of mealworms in a cage and expecting them to eat it is not adequate. And I like to start with a liquid diet, even if it's the healthiest thing that ever came through the door. Giving them a liquid diet gives them the idea that, hey, something good's coming from this giant hand attached to a terrifying predator. And then some bats really have a hard time making that transition to dishes and may never learn, and you may be hand feeding for their entire time in rehabilitation, but that is what it is. And then our Myotis species are just super geniuses, and they figure it out and they don't need your help. But you just have to know what species you're dealing with and take the time to get them eating. Animal that should be hungry, that isn't eating anything, warrants investigation. You need to look for pain responses, dehydration. Is the thing you're offering palatable? And you need to think about the temperature of the food and the bat. A bat that is not euthermic is not going to eat well for you. So the bat needs to be warm and the food cannot be straight out of the refrigerator. And I'm going to hustle along a little bit here. So medical care, they deserve medical care. They deserve appropriate medical care. Rehabilitators have to work with knowledgeable vets because therapies and protocols change. We're getting better equipment. We're getting better drugs. Bats deserve just as good medical care as bald eagles or raccoons or whatever else. Veterinarians do need to be able to provide timely care, though. It's not fair to take these animals and say, oh, yeah, I know it's got a fracture, but I can't see you till Thursday. You know, help your rehabbers help your vets. Let's get these animals more timely care. Rehabbers, follow your vet's guidance, and timely and appropriate euthanasia must be available to rehabilitators. Some of these animals come in so broken, it's not fair to make them wait 12 hours to get to someone who can do a euthanasia. So I think this is a big issue, and I think states need to grapple with this, that wildlife it shouldn't be left suffering because of, regulatory issues. There has to be a way to get these animals quick, swift, and appropriate euthanasia, because that's the gift that stops suffering. And the old saying is better a day too soon than a day too late where euthanasia is concerned. So you house them just the same way you house the juveniles, just with the caveat that big brown bats can and will chew through butterfly netting. So same principle, space, crevices, appropriate to the species. You do want to prevent harm, but you also need to give them enough space to do what they need to do. A few more examples. And here's the flight cage I was talking about. So it needs to be big. We use UV lights to bring the insects in. So even a bat that's been overwintering needs a little bit of time to get its wings back and remember that it can catch bugs by itself. Make sure food and water is accessible, that the roosts are appropriate, and that it is safe from predators. Release them, release them, release them. Make sure they can sustain flight. Can they make altitude changes? Can they flip and land with their hind feet? Can they take off from the ground? Please stop telling people that our native insectivores can't take off from the ground, because it's one of my tests to make sure they are ready for release. They can take off from the ground. For juveniles, they must dislike you at this point. And for colonial juveniles, please don't hard release a single. Release them with a cohort, soft release with a cohort, or release into a known colony of conspecifics. They're very plastic and they seem to not mind taking on juveniles. So just don't take a single juvenile that's never been out there in the world before and just release it in your backyard. That's not an animal that's going to survive. And if you do it right, this is sort of the sequence. This little pup was exploring and then has learned how to do it for herself. And actually, she's already full. You can see from the top line there that she's got a pretty full belly, but we just let them play around with the nipple until they either fall asleep or lose interest. Or take it away. And then as they get a little older, we're going to transition. What I do often is transition them to a formula that's got a little bit of bug nutrition mixed in, and she's managed to get some all over her face, but there she's full and falling asleep. Until she figures out I'm watching. And then here's a little older one is soliciting. That's that solicitation behavior with the wings. We're going to start really encouraging that. We want them to really interact. Not so much with us, but to be interacting with the world. Let me just make that a caveat. We want to make sure there you get nice wing stretching. That is a precursor to flight. They start stretching the wings. They start doing push-ups. And then finally out into the flight area, where they can practice. And you can see they've got lots of food and roost choices available, and they're taking full advantage of the space. That one just did a turn. And that's what we want to see. And then what we do is the backside of the flight cage opens up. We open it at dark and shut it at dawn, and they leave when they're ready. And so that's how it goes, and that's how it's done correctly. Please, if you're not already rehabilitating bats, please do, but please do it correctly. And I believe I left enough time for some questions.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. First question, are there bats bred in captivity or rescued from dealers / auctions that undergo conditioning for eventual release into the natural habitat?
I cannot answer that question because typically in North America, bat rehabilitation is wild animals off the landscape, coming to a rehabilitator, returning to the landscape. So we don't deal with bats rescued from dealers. Those would be mostly exotic fruit bats. So that's not what we're doing. We're doing native species that are going to go back to the landscape if at all possible.
Next question, beyond vertical or horizontal glass, do you have any other recommendations regarding a closure design and its impact on echolocation and vocalizations to ensure bat welfare?
Oh, do I? Yeah, I don't think these animals should be housed in hard-sided enclosures at all. We use mesh. We use a lot of soft surfaces, not just because it helps with sound, it keeps sound from just bouncing, but because it's also launderable. But mesh enclosures allow sound to pass through, and they can hear other bats in the facility, whereas there's absolutely no reason to be using glass aquaria or critter keepers in this day and age when we have access to all these other types of housing that are much more appropriate, that allow bats to hang and climb and move, that you can enrich appropriately. And also the concept of using an aquarium or a critter keeper that opens from the top for an animal that hangs from the top of things, just, I don't understand it. And I think a lot of people cling to the glass aquaria and hard-sided enclosures because of either misguided concepts about safety or because of convenience of racking on shelving, and that shouldn't be the driver. We should be being driven by what the animals need in our care to successfully exist on the landscape, and not whether or not we can fit 30 of them on a shelf, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Next question, with bats being so social and needing to learn so much, would captive adults make good foster parents for pups?
So that is a really interesting question. There is not, so the sample sizes are so small that, we don't get a lot of adults with young. We sometimes will get a pregnant bat that can't be released, and we'll have pups in care. And I tell you what, they are resource strapped. So there is some evidence that big brown bats will not tolerate anybody but their own. But then again, we haven't really had the opportunity to take a adult who's recently lost a pup and a pup who's recently been orphaned and then see if that can happen. So I really think it's an issue of there just aren't enough opportunities to explore that. We do know that red bats seem to be willing to take whoever, but I mean, they've got a really hard job. If they're already trying to raise 3 pups, I wouldn't give them a 4th because, they might not have enough resources to do it. So I like using them more as surrogates than fosters because, and I'll explain that a little bit. I want the juveniles with the adults, so the adults that can teach them those social behaviors, so that when the juveniles go out on the landscape, they know what a submissive posture is, or a submissive vocalization. They know when someone's irritated with them, then they should back off and not get themselves beat up. So I think at that juvenile adult interface is where we have the most opportunity in rehabilitation to get these guys a little additional help on how to be bats. But as far as that young, where, having a foster mother take on a young pup, there just aren't a lot of opportunities to do that and see how it goes.
Okay, thank you. How likely can a mom pick up a pup from the ground?
Well, that's another bazillion-dollar question. So, it kind of depends on the size of the pup and where the pup is in relation to the mother. So we're doing a lot with, they use the system in the UK where it's a step ladder and a heater, and you put the pup up so the mom can fly by, land, pick up the pup and keep going. Because after a few days, these pups are really big and the bats can really struggle to get off the ground with them. So there's a lot to it. I don't think that a mother can get flat on the ground, pick up a furred pup and get off the ground with it. Now, she may very well be able to go up a tree, but I've seen these mothers trying to move these large pups, and if the pups aren't helping by clinging on, I mean, if they're dragging their feet behind, it's a really tall order. So I think using things like pup catchers or even shelving where a pup can land and wait for the mom to pick it up, so it's not down at the base of the wall of a house that's covered in, siding that a pup can't climb. I think those are important considerations when we're dealing with outdoor colonies.
Okay, thank you. At what age do bats' joints fuse, and are they sexually mature before fusion happens?
Boy, they fuse usually prior to the onset of needing to migrate or move for the winter. But with climate change, all bets are off. We're starting to see later and later juveniles coming in that are still small and who actually grow. If they end up with us and we keep them for the winter, they're actually still growing during winter. So I don't even feel comfortable answering that right now. I think there's way too much change going on to really give a hard answer. And the other thing to remember about bat development, at least for native insectivores, it's entirely dependent on the mother's ability to feed and the warmth and conditions under which those pups are living. So that might be where being a heterothermic endotherm could be a disadvantage, because if the mom can't keep the pup warm enough for it to grow fast, it may be delayed. So if a climate event happens and it's abnormally cold, those pups may not do well. And we saw that with a large bat colony last summer, where it looks like the entire cohort of pups was dropped because we dropped into the 40s at night for 2 weeks during early pup season. So I don't think I can answer that 100%.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How do you get flying insects through the mesh into your pre-release flight enclosure for juvenile practice?
I don't know how bugs do it, but they do it. We use an 1/8 inch mesh on the inside, and then we have one little panel that's a 1/4 inch. And I cannot believe the size of some of the insects I find in that flight cage, to a point where some of them I actually remove because they're like tilehorn prionis or the toe biter flying. Some of them are like bigger than the bats. So just running those UV lights, the bugs come in, and I feel like sometimes I feel kind of guilty because I feel like I've created an artificial light trap for insects. But the songbirds seem to appreciate what's on the outside as well as the bats appreciate what's on the inside. So but yeah, you can get bugs inside. You do have to make sure your mesh is not, bug mesh or really fine window screening mesh. It's got to be, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch is safe for bats. And then, like I said, I just have a small panel in there that's 1/4 inch. So that allows some of the bigger bugs to get in. And it does allow May beetles to get in. And May beetles seem to be an important part of bat foraging for the adults that are pre-release in the spring. So it's pretty dramatic when they catch them.
Hey, thank you. What is meant by clean your worms before serving?
Oh, thank you for asking that. So you've got your mealworms in the substrate, and I have to thank Amanda Lawler for teaching me this over 20 years ago, and I'm still doing it. But you take them out of the refrigerator, out of the nutritious substrate that they've been living in, and you sift them through a colander, and most of the substrate and all the gook falls away. You put them in a tray underneath a light, and they are negatively phototactic. So the living, healthy, plump mealworms crawl away from the light and go to the dark end, and that's the cleaned mealworms. They leave all their little dead friends and shed exoskeletons behind, and you get those cleaned mealworms that are now ready for feeding.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Leslie. We have still have some other questions. We'll consolidate those and send those to you. And again, if you want to reach out to Leslie, you can do so on Hoover directly and ask your questions of her as well.
All right. Thank you again, Leslie.